We're here today to release a report about pensions, the timing is troubling for us in the labor movement. Earlier this month, the UCP-aligned government of Scott Moe in Saskatchewan announced that it is considering using public money to invest in oil and gas projects that are having trouble finding private investors. As leaders of Alberta's labor movement and representatives of hundreds of thousands of Albertans who have been saving for their retirements through our province's big public sector pension plans, this development has put a number of burning questions in our mind. First, is Alberta Premier Jason Kenney and his United Conservative Party government thinking of doing something similar here in Alberta? Second, is the UCP planning to ignore the very loud signals coming from the markets and use taxpayer money to finance risky ventures in the oil and gas sector? Third, and perhaps most urgently, are they eyeing the billions of dollars saved by hundreds of thousands of ordinary Albertans for their retirements in our province's big pension plans? Today, we're releasing a report that outlines troubling signs that the Alberta government is indeed thinking of going down this road. The report, entitled "Don't You Dare: Why Working Albertans Don't Trust Jason Kenney with Their Retirement Savings," points out that banks, global investment firms, and insurance companies are all becoming more cautious about investments in oil and gas. And it asks the question, does it make sense to ignore the caution of these experts? The report also reviews the various changes made to pension governance by the UCP in the last session of the legislature, changes that give the government more control over Alberta's big public sector pension plans. Overall, these changes dramatically undermine the independence of public sector pensions in Alberta and introduce an unprecedented level of potential political interference. So we're here today to demand that the UCP repeal sections of Bill 22 that has given the government what we think are inappropriate levels of control over Alberta's pensions. We're also here to convey the message that, frankly, all of us have been hearing loud and clear from our members. They're telling us to tell Jason Kenney, don't you dare use our retirement savings to fund your political agenda. Why are we so concerned? From our perspective, the signs are all there. Comments from a number of prominent UCP surrogates, as well as the Premier himself, suggest that the government is preparing to make the argument that global investors are illogically and unfairly abandoning our oil and gas sector, so Albertans, for the sake of our economy and our prosperity, need to fill the gap either with direct government funding or with money diverted from the Heritage Fund or the pension funds managed by the provincially owned investment agency AIMCO. As most objective observers will acknowledge, the Premier has clearly been crafting a narrative to provide justification for these kinds of unprecedented moves. For example, he consistently claims that the collapse of investment in Alberta's oil and gas sector is the result of what he describes as foreign-funded campaigns aimed at besmirching our province's reputation, as opposed to more mundane and, we would argue, more plausible explanations. For example, that investors are turning away from Alberta oil and gas for the same reasons that they've been turning away from the sector in other parts of the world: low oil prices, supply gluts, poor returns, and an increasing realization that prudence requires investors to quantify and price in the financial risks associated with climate change. In addition to crafting a narrative to justify spending public money and the private savings of hundreds of thousands of Albertans on projects that private investors and private markets are showing an increasing reluctance to support themselves, the Premier has also given himself new mechanisms and tools to seize control of the money he seems interested in using to fund his agenda. Specifically, in November of 2019, over the strenuous objections of public sector unions and public sector workers, the government passed Bill 22, the so-called Reform of Agencies, Boards and Commissions and Government Enterprises Act. Among other things, the bill stripped the Alberta Teachers Retirement Fund, the ATRF, of its traditional independence and forced it to use government-owned AIMCO as its investment manager, as opposed to making its own investment decisions, as it has been doing successfully for decades. The bill also stripped Alberta's other big public sector pension plans, the Local Authorities Pension Plan, or LAP, the Public Services Pension Plan, or PSPP, and the Special Forces Pension Plan, SFPP, stripped them of their right, which they had previously had, to switch to other investment managers if they lost confidence in AIMCO. To add insult to injury, Bill 22 also made a number of changes to the boards of all of these pension plans, changes that are clearly designed to strengthen government control by weakening the influence of the people who actually fund the plans, Alberta public sector workers and their employers. In essence, Bill 22 extended and cemented the government's control over the money that hundreds of thousands of Albertans have been saving diligently and at significant personal cost to themselves month after month, year after year, for their own retirements. These changes, in combination with the political direction promoted by UCP leaders and UCP-leaning surrogates and commentators, raise serious questions about the overall intent of the UCP. As Albertans today, we in the provincial labour movement recognize and appreciate the huge contribution that the oil and gas sector has made and continues to make to our province. The sector is the biggest engine of our provincial economy and indeed one of the biggest engines of the Canadian economy. We are also not opposed to our pension plans investing in oil and gas projects as long as those projects actually make sense from both a financial and an environmental point of view. However, we think it would be unwise and irresponsible to use either public dollars or the retirement savings of hundreds of thousands of Albertans to do what the markets and the global investment community are increasingly reluctant to do themselves. In this report that we're releasing today, we show that the flight of investment from the oil and gas sector has much more to do with mundane, and we would argue logical factors, such as oversupply, low prices, low returns, and legitimate concerns about stranded assets than it does about conspiracies, about foreign-funded campaigns against our province. The world's leading investment firms, bond rating agencies, insurance companies, and central banks are all saying that a reckoning is coming for the oil and gas sector, not just here in Alberta, but globally. Jason Kenney may believe that he can hold back this tide of well-informed caution with ads and fake news stories from his so far comically inept war room, otherwise known as the Canadian Energy Centre. But we do not share his confidence. In fact, we think he is deluding himself and in the process leading Albertans into a dangerous economic dead end. If Premier Kenney wants to invest his own personal money to prop up companies and projects that experienced global investors have rejected, then fine. And if he convinces many individual Albertans to do the same with their own personal savings, that's also fine. But if he wants to use public money or the accumulated retirement savings of hundreds of thousands of Albertans for these purposes, then we say, don't you dare. He has neither the consent from pension plan participants nor the mandate from voters to do either of these things. With all of this in mind, on behalf of the hundreds of thousands of Albertans who are worried about the UCP and what they're planning, and when it comes to using retirement savings to fund these irresponsible political agendas, we demand that Bill 22 be revoked. In particular, we demand that the Alberta Teachers Retirement Fund once again be given the power to manage investments themselves, as has been their long-standing practice. We also demand that Alberta's other big pension plans, LAPP, PSPP, and SFPP, be given back the right to choose different investment managers if they lose confidence in AIMCO. Finally, we demand that the changes aimed at stacking pension boards with government surrogates and yes men be revoked. These three measures, taken together, will ensure the retirement savings of hundreds of thousands of Albertans are not invested in ways that they have not given consent to. In a similar vein, we demand that the UCP secure the support of Albertans either through a new election or a referendum before they use public funds, public savings, or money diverted from contributions of Albertans to the Canada Pension Plan to support corporations or projects that cannot generate sufficient support from investors and markets. In conclusion, I want to urge my fellow Albertans to give Premier Kenney's narrative about foreign-funded conspiracies more scrutiny. There is no doubt that our Premier is an impressive showman, but his razzle-dazzle performance aimed at turning our very real economic anxieties and fears into politically exploitable anger is preventing us from seeing, hearing, and responding to the warning signals that are coming, not just from environmentalists, but increasingly from markets and investors as well. For the sake of our province's workers and retirees, we need to say a very firm no if the UCP suggests risking our retirement savings, whether those savings are housed in public sector pension plans or in Alberta's contributions to CPP. We need to say a very firm no in order to defy if he wants to use these monies to defy the economic laws of gravity. We also need to raise serious questions if they propose to use tax dollars or savings in the Heritage Fund to fund projects that can't win support from investors, banks, insurers, or bond rating agencies. Public revenue spent and perhaps lost on these ventures will be money that's not available to fund the programs and services that Alberta families, communities, and indeed businesses rely upon, like education, healthcare, and infrastructure. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, we need to start asking ourselves questions like these. Is this the best way to deal with a future that almost everyone agrees is going to look different than our past? Should we continue to play the blame game and look for scapegoats, or would it make more sense to prepare our citizens for an economy that will be characterized by change? Should we use our limited resources to double down on the past, or should we focus on investing in the future? The way we answer these questions will shape the future of our province. From our perspective, this is an emperor has no clothes moment for all Albertans. Premier Kenney is selling snake oil. We don't have to swallow it. He is asking us to build an economic future on a foundation of political spin, but we don't have to let him. As leaders of Alberta's labor movement, we firmly believe, as citizens, that we need to call the Premier out on his irresponsible and misleading characterizations of the challenges facing our province. We need to say that the emperor has no clothes. We also firmly believe that the best way to defend jobs, wages, and livelihoods of working Albertans is to prepare for the future rather than to pretend against all evidence that we can go back to the past. So that brings us to the end of this press conference. I would like to thank everyone who has joined us on Facebook Live for tuning in. Please help us send the message to Jason Kenney and the UCP, hands off our pensions, and don't you dare use our pension savings for purposes that they were not intended for. Thanks for joining us.